In the dense, towering woods of Northern California, nestled between the shadows of the Sierra Nevada mountains, sat the quiet and unassuming town of Keddie. It was a place where neighbors knew each other by name, where children played until the last light of dusk, and where danger seemed like a distant concept, something reserved for big cities and crime novels. But on the morning of April 12, 1981, that illusion of safety was shattered forever. Inside cabin 28 of the Keddie Resort, a horror beyond imagination had unfolded. A mother and 3 children were brutally slain, their bodies left in a gruesome tableau of violence. The scene was so savage, so methodically staged, that even the most seasoned investigators struggled to comprehend it. And yet, despite the brutality of the crime, there was something even more chilling. Inside the same cabin, just feet away from the carnage, 3 children had been left unharmed. It was as if the killer had handpicked his victims, leaving behind silent witnesses who would carry the weight of that night for the rest of their lives. Keddie, once a bustling railroad town, had seen better days. By the early 1980s, it had become a faded shell of its former self, a haven for those looking to escape the pressures of city life. Among them was Glenna Sue Sharp, a 36-year-old mother who had moved to Keddie with her 5 children in search of a fresh start. They lived in Cabin 28, a modest home that, though small and worn, offered the Sharps a sense of stability. Sue was a strong, independent woman who had endured her share of hardships. A survivor of an abusive marriage, she had left her husband behind and was determined to carve out a better life for her children. Life wasn't easy. The family relied on welfare and odd jobs, but they were making it work. And in Keddie, Sue had found a sense of community, forming close friendships with her neighbors and raising her children in what she believed was a safe environment. But beneath the surface, Keddie wasn't as peaceful as it seemed. April 11, 1981, had been an ordinary day for the Sharps. That evening, Sue's eldest daughter, Sheila, left to spend the night at a friend's house. Back at Cabin 28, Sue was at home with her son, John, 15, his friend Dana Wingate, 17, and her daughter, Tina, 12. Sue's younger children, Rick, 10, Greg, 5, and their friend Justin, were in another bedroom, fast asleep. Sometime during the night, an evil crept into the cabin. The attack was swift and merciless. John and Dana were bound with electrical wire and medical tape before being bludgeoned and stabbed repeatedly. Sue, too, was bound and gagged, suffering brutal blows before her throat was slit. Tina, the youngest victim, was nowhere to be found. When Sheila returned the next morning, she opened the door to a scene of pure carnage. The lifeless bodies of her mother, brother, and his friend were sprawled across the cabin floor, blood pooling beneath them. The furniture was overturned, the walls bore the marks of struggle, and the air was thick with the metallic scent of death. And then the silence. No screams, no wailing sirens, just the quiet realization that a family had been annihilated while the world outside remained oblivious. From the beginning, something about the crime didn't add up. There were no signs of forced entry, suggesting the killer or killers had either been let in or had a key. The crime scene itself was bizarre. The level of overkill, the way the bodies had been arranged, and the seemingly targeted nature of the attack pointed to something personal. Even stranger, the 3 youngest boys had been left completely unharmed. How had they not heard the brutal attack happening just a few feet away? Why had the killer spared them? And most disturbingly, what had happened to Tina? In the days that followed, law enforcement scoured the area, searching for the missing girl, but there was no trace of her. It was as if she had vanished into the night, taken by a phantom who had already left so much devastation in his wake. As investigators dug deeper, whispers began to spread through Keddie. Some believed the crime was a message, a warning meant for someone who had crossed the wrong person. Others suspected the involvement of someone close to the family, someone who had easy access to Cabin 28. Theories ranged from drug-related violence to an act of revenge, but one name kept surfacing in hushed conversations: Martin Smart. A local man with a violent temper, Martin had been at the Keddie bar the night of the murders, reportedly complaining about Sue Sharp. His wife, Marilyn, later claimed he had made chilling statements about the crime, even going so far as to confess to a therapist. And yet, despite these alarming signs, no arrest was made. Why had law enforcement seemed so reluctant to follow leads? Had the killer been protected by someone in power? Then, nearly 3 years after the murders, a breakthrough. Tina's remains were found in a remote area miles away from Keddie. Her fate had been sealed that night, her body discarded like an afterthought. But why take her and leave the others? As the years passed, the case grew colder. Evidence was lost. Files went missing. Witnesses refused to speak. But then, decades later, a discovery would shake the case once more. In 2016, a long-forgotten recording surfaced. A chilling call made to the sheriff's department in 1984, reporting the location of Tina's remains. The caller had known exactly where to look, years before the remains were officially discovered. And yet, that lead had never been pursued. Who had made that call? And more importantly, why had law enforcement ignored it? The Keddie Cabin Murders remain one of the most haunting unsolved crimes in American history. Was it a botched investigation, a cover-up, or something even darker lurking beneath the surface? And, perhaps most disturbingly of all, was the killer still out there, watching, waiting? To this day, the ghost of Cabin 28 lingers, its walls whispering secrets that may never be revealed. And just beyond the trees, in the quiet embrace of the Sierra Nevadas, the shadows still hold their secrets. But for how much longer? The silence of Keddie's pine-covered valley was oppressive, as if the very land itself recoiled from the horror that had unfolded in Cabin 28. The crime had left more questions than answers, but one thing was certain. The killer had been ruthless, methodical, and he had taken a trophy. Tina Sharp was missing. Her absence turned a brutal murder into something even more disturbing. Had she been taken as a witness, a captive, or had she suffered an even worse fate than those left behind? No one knew, and perhaps that was the most terrifying part of all. Decades later, in 2016, a discovery would resurface, a forgotten recording buried in the sheriff's archives. A call had come into the Plumas County Sheriff's Office back in 1984, 3 years after the murders. The voice on the line was calm, unnervingly so. I was wondering if they ever found the remains of the little girl up in Keddie. The caller asked. There was a pause, the rustling of papers. What girl? The dispatcher responded. Tina Sharp, the voice said, without hesitation. Then came the most chilling part. I heard her skull was found at Camp 18. It was true. 3 years after the murders, a human skull fragment and a few bones had been discovered in a remote area known as Camp 18, some 50 miles from Keddie. Dental records confirmed the remains belonged to Tina Sharp. But how had the caller known about it before law enforcement did? Who had made that call? And why had the recording been ignored for decades? Investigators scrambled to reconstruct the events of that deadly night in 1981, but what they found only deepened the mystery. Witness statements were inconsistent. Some neighbors reported hearing muffled screams around 1:30 a.m., while others insisted they heard nothing at all. One claimed to have seen a van idling near Cabin 28, but the details were vague. And then there was Justin Smart. The 12-year-old boy had been in the cabin that night, sleeping in the same room as Sue's 2 youngest sons. At first, he insisted he hadn't heard anything, but as time passed, his story changed. Under hypnosis, Justin recalled seeing something, an argument, a struggle. He described 2 men attacking Sue, John, and Dana, detailing their weapons, their brutality. One had a mustache, he said. The other wore glasses. One held a knife, the other a hammer. It was an astonishing revelation, but there was one problem. No one knew if it was real. Had Justin truly seen the murders? Or had his mind filled in the blanks with something imagined? Something suggested? Was his memory reliable or manipulated? Then came the detail that chilled investigators to their core. Justin claimed he saw one of the men take Tina. He described her crying, struggling, before she was carried out into the night. If he was telling the truth, it meant Tina had still been alive when the killer left. And that meant someone out there had taken her. As police dug deeper, a troubling figure emerged, Martin Smart, Justin's stepfather. Martin had lived just down the road from the Sharps. He had been at the local bar that night, drinking with his friend, Bo Babade, an ex-con with ties to organized crime. Witnesses recalled Martin's volatile temper, The way he spoke about Sue Sharp with seething resentment. His wife, Marilyn, later came forward with a chilling admission. Martin had hated Sue. He had made disturbing comments about her before the murders. And, most damning of all, he had thrown out his bloody hammer just days after the killings. When Marilyn confronted him, he reportedly told her, "You know why that hammer's gone." Despite this, Martin was never arrested. Neither was Beau Babade. And then, in a bizarre twist, both men vanished, one to Reno, the other to death. As suspicion mounted against Martin Smart, something strange happened. Key pieces of evidence disappeared. Reports were misplaced. Crucial witness statements were buried. The case seemed intentionally mishandled. Investigators who later reopened the case believed that someone had covered up the crime, perhaps to protect a suspect, or perhaps because the truth was too dangerous. Sheriff Doug Thomas, who had overseen the initial investigation, had known Martin Smart personally. Some even claimed they were friends. Was that why no charges were ever filed? Or was there another reason Martin and Beau had been allowed to walk free? In 2013, an envelope surfaced in the case files, one that should have been investigated decades earlier. It was a handwritten letter addressed to Marilyn Smart. "I've paid the price for your love," it read, "and now that I've done what I did, I can't even love you anymore." The signature? Martin Smart. Investigators were stunned. Had Martin confessed, in his own twisted way, to the murders? If so, why had this letter never been used against him? But there was something even stranger. Just before he died, Martin had reportedly made another confession to a VA therapist. He had admitted to the Keddie Murders. The therapist had even passed this information along to law enforcement. Yet nothing had been done. As the case was re-examined, more missing evidence was discovered. In 2016, Plumas County Sheriff Greg Hagwood revealed that a hammer had been found, one matching the description of the one Martin had discarded. It had been buried in a nearby pond for years. But the biggest question remained unanswered. Why had Tina been taken? If the murders were an act of rage, why not kill all the children? Why take just her? There was one final lead, one that, if true, suggested the case was even darker than anyone imagined. According to some theories, Tina had been taken for a purpose. Some investigators believed she had been kept alive for a time, and others feared that her murder had not been the last. If that was true, then the Keddie Cabin Murders were not just a tragic night of violence. They were the beginning of something much worse. Something that may still be out there, buried beneath layers of deception, lost evidence, and whispered confessions. And in the shadows of Sierra Nevada, in the silent ruins of Cabin 28, the ghosts of Keddie still linger, waiting for the truth to finally come to light. But what if the truth was never meant to be found? The air inside the Plumas County Sheriff's Office was heavy with tension as the detective unfolded the brittle, yellow paper. The letter had been sitting in the case files for years, forgotten, ignored. Addressed to Marilyn Smart, it was chilling in its simplicity. "I've paid the price for your love, and now that I've done what I did, I can't even love you anymore." Martin Smart's confession? It was vague, cryptic, but in a case plagued by missing evidence and ignored leads, it was damning. Sheriff Greg Hagwood sat in silence, rereading the words. If this was a confession, why had no one acted on it? Why had Martin been allowed to leave town? And more importantly, had Marilyn known the truth all along? As investigators re-examined the case, a name surfaced, one that had never been made public. A woman, now in her late 50s, claimed she had been at the Keddie Bar on the night of April 11th, 1981. She had seen Martin Smart, and she had seen something else, something that made her blood run cold. Martin was drunk, she told investigators, her voice trembling. Angry, he kept saying that woman, Sue Sharp, was ruining everything. She hesitated, and then he said something I never forgot. He leaned over to Beau and said, "She won't be a problem after tonight." The word sent a shiver down the detective's spine. If she was telling the truth, this was premeditated murder. But there was something else. The woman recalled seeing Martin and Beau leave the bar shortly after midnight. But they weren't alone. They left with a third man, someone the police had never investigated. For years, law enforcement had focused on Martin Smart and Bo Babade. But what if they weren't the only ones involved? Could there have been a third man in Cabin 28 that night? As investigators pressed the witness for details, she grew uneasy. "I don't know his name," she admitted, "but I remember his jacket. It had a military patch on the sleeve." A military patch. Suddenly, the case took a sinister turn. Bo Babade had been an ex-con with ties to organized crime. But Martin Smart? He had served in the military. Had they met someone in Keddie? Another veteran? Someone with experience in violence? Or worse, had they been working with someone from the inside? The deeper investigators dug, the more disturbing the inconsistencies became. One piece of evidence stood out: a bloody footprint found inside Cabin 28. It didn't match Martin Smart. It didn't match Bo Babade. It didn't belong to any of the victims. So, who did it belong to? And why had law enforcement ignored it? Then, another disturbing revelation. Sheriff Doug Thomas, the man who had led the original investigation, had been close friends with Martin Smart. Some sources even claimed he had stayed at the Smart residence on multiple occasions. Had he covered for Martin? Had he intentionally buried evidence? It certainly seemed that way. A former deputy came forward with a chilling claim. There was more evidence, he said. Reports went missing. Someone higher up didn't want this case solved. But why? As investigators combed through old records, they uncovered something they never expected: a second missing person case. A teenage girl had disappeared from a nearby town just months before the Keddie murders. Her case had never been connected. Until now. She had been last seen getting into a car with two men. One of them had a military patch on his jacket. And then came the most horrifying discovery of all. Her body had been found in a shallow grave near Camp 18, the same place Tina Sharp's remains had been discovered. For years, the assumption had been that Tina had been taken because she was a witness, or because she had been singled out for some unknown reason. But what if it wasn't just Tina? What if there had been others? What if the Keddie Cabin murders weren't a random act of violence at all? What if they were part of something much bigger? Something much darker? As investigators pieced together the horrifying puzzle, one thing became terrifyingly clear. The man in the military jacket, whoever he was, had never been caught, and if he was still out there, he might not have stopped. The revelation that Tina Sharp's remains had been discovered near another victim's grave sent shockwaves through the investigation. For years, the Keddie Cabin murders have been seen as an isolated act of brutality. A family targeted, butchered, and left for dead in the middle of the night. But now, a new and terrifying possibility was emerging. What if Keddie had never been about Sue Sharp at all? What if this had been the work of a serial killer? The public erupted. News outlets, once silent on the case, reignited the conversation. Social media sleuths pored over old documents. Theories ran wild, and for the first time in decades, the people of Plumas County felt the chilling realization that the killer, or killers, might still be out there. And they might have killed again. The hunt for the man in the military jacket. Sheriff Greg Hagwood, determined to solve the case once and for all, issued a public appeal. "We need anyone with information about this unidentified suspect to come forward. The man in the military jacket. Someone out there knows who he is." Calls flooded in. Most were dead ends, crackpot theories, hazy recollections. But one stood out. A retired bartender from Keddie. "I remember him," the man said. "Came into the bar a few times. He didn't talk much, but he was always with Martin and Bo. Had this intense look in his eyes. Real cold." "Did he have a name?" The bartender hesitated. "No, but I remember his tattoo. A black widow spider, inked onto his wrist. It was a tiny detail, but enough to light a fire under investigators. If this man had been in Keddie that night, had connections to Smart and Babade, and had possibly been involved in Tina Sharp's abduction, they had to find him. As law enforcement scoured records, a forgotten file from 1981 resurfaced. A witness had reported a strange man in Keddie around the time of the murders. He had been staying at a nearby motel, paid in cash, and disappeared the morning after the crime. The description matched. Tall, lean, military-style haircut, a black widow tattoo. And then came the most chilling discovery of all. His name had been on an old arrest record. Richard "Spider" Carlson, a former Marine, a convicted felon, and someone who had been suspected in the disappearance of at least 2 women in California in the late 1970s. But here was the most disturbing part. After leaving Keddie, Carlson had vanished. Investigators traced Carlson's last known whereabouts. The trail was cold, but not dead. In the early 2000s, he had been spotted in Arizona, living under an alias. Then in 2012, a tip placed him in Oregon. And then nothing. No arrests. No known address. It was as if he had slipped into the shadows. But there was one place left to look. His past. Carlson had grown up in a small Nevada town, just a few hours from Keddie. His childhood home was long abandoned, but a check of property records revealed something chilling. A remote hunting cabin, deep in the Sierra Nevada mountains. Still in his name. Still untouched. Armed with a search warrant, a SWAT team and investigators made the treacherous journey to Carlson's hidden cabin. The area was desolate. No neighbors, no phone lines, just towering pines and silence. The cabin itself was a relic from another time. The wood had darkened with age, the windows covered in grime. But there was one detail that made the officers' stomachs turn. Outside, nailed to the front door, was a sign. "Keep out. I know what you're here for." Inside, the air was thick with dust and decay. Empty cans lined the countertops, old newspapers stacked in the corners. And then, in the back room, they found it, a wall of photographs. Newspaper clippings of missing women. One, in particular, stood out, a black and white image of Tina Sharp, pinned directly in the center. Before the team could process what they had found, movement outside sent them scrambling. Carlson was there. The years had not been kind to him. His once lean frame had grown frail, his face lined with deep creases. But his eyes, they were as cold as ever. He raised his hand slowly, a smirk creeping onto his lips. "You finally found me," he said, almost amused. The officers moved in, weapons raised, but Carlson didn't resist. Instead, he laughed, a slow, chilling sound. "You think this is over?" he murmured. "It's never over." And then, before anyone could stop him, he pulled a knife from his belt and drove it into his own throat. Blood spattered the walls as he collapsed, his body convulsing before finally going still. In the days that followed, investigators combed through Carlson's cabin. What they found only deepened the nightmare. Journals, filled with ramblings about cleansing the weak. Maps with locations marked, some of them corresponding to missing persons cases. And then, the most horrifying discovery, a Polaroid, taken in the 1980s, of a young girl, terrified, bound, and gagged. It wasn't Tina. It was someone else. Had Carlson been part of something larger? Had he worked alone, or had there been others? The case was cracked wide open. But even with Carlson dead, one question remained. Had justice truly been served? The old ruins of Cabin 28 had long since been demolished, but the memory of what happened there would never fade. For the families of the victims, there was no closure, only the dull ache of mystery that had lingered for far too long. And for the investigators who had spent years chasing shadows, the final realization was the hardest to bear. Carlson had died with his secrets. And somewhere, out there in the vast wilderness, were the graves of women who had never been found. The Keddie Cabin Murders were over, but the darkness they left behind would never fade. The news of Richard "Spider" Carlson's death spread like wildfire. After decades of silence, after false leads and ignored evidence, the man who might have been the true mastermind behind the Keddie Cabin Murders had finally been unmasked. Law enforcement held a press conference, their words carefully chosen. "This case has haunted Plumas County for over 40 years, Sheriff Greg Hagwood declared. "Today, we can finally say we have answers. While we may never know the full extent of Carlson's crimes, we believe he played a central role in what happened that night in Cabin 28. But was it really over? The public wanted closure. Carlson was dead, his blood staining the floor of his own hideaway. His cabin had been filled with eerie evidence, maps, photographs, writings that hinted at a much larger, more disturbing spree of violence. Yet, For every piece that seemed to fit the puzzle, another jagged edge remained. Had Carlson lived, he would have faced trial. He would have been forced to answer the questions that had tormented investigators for decades. Did he work alone? Why was Tina Sharp taken? And perhaps the most unsettling of all, how many others had suffered at his hands? Instead, he had stolen the truth from the world with one final act of violence. His suicide was convenient, too convenient. His body was barely cold before conspiracy theories began swirling. Had he really killed himself? Or had someone silenced him? There were those who believed Carlson had never been alone, that the same forces who had covered for Martin Smart and Beau Babade had been protecting someone else all along. And if that was true, was the real monster still out there? The discovery of Carlson's journals led to another chilling wave of speculation. Some pages contained frantic, nearly illegible scribblings about purging the weak and cleansing the world of those he saw as burdens. But others were different. They were precise, methodical. There were notes about how to move a body without leaving traces, how to ensure a victim never screamed, how to make someone disappear. And then there were the maps. Some locations were known, places where remains had been discovered, cold cases long thought unsolvable. But others, they were blank, marked with nothing more than a single black X. Were these graves waiting to be found? As the news spread, so did the myths. Cabin 28 had already been the subject of whispered stories, ghost hunts, and macabre curiosity. But with Carlson's name now attached, the horror took on a new life. People claimed to see shadowy figures near the site where the cabin once stood. Others swore they heard screams carried on the wind at night. A local reporter dug into old archives and found something chilling. Residents of Keddie had long spoken of an unknown drifter who had lurked around the town in the months before the murders. A man with piercing eyes. A man who never seemed to leave footprints in the dirt. And strangest of all, a man who'd been seen in town again. Recently, with Carlson dead, investigators began closing up the case files. It wasn't a perfect resolution, but it was the closest they had ever come. Then, an officer at the evidence storage facility made an unsettling discovery. A sealed envelope, buried under decades of dust. It had been marked for destruction years earlier, but had never been thrown away. Inside was a small plastic bag, and inside that bag, a single scrap of fabric. It had been found at the original crime scene in 1981. Investigators had assumed it belonged to one of the victims, but no DNA testing had been done at the time. Now, they ran it through the database, and when the results came back, they sent a chill down every investigator's spine. The DNA didn't belong to Carlson. It didn't belong to Martin Smart or Beau Babade. It belonged to someone who had never been named in the case. Someone still alive. And worst of all, someone who had been in Keddie just months before Carlson's death. Carlson had known something before he died. His final words, "It's never over," now felt like a warning. Had he been covering for someone? Had he taken the blame for a crime he didn't fully commit? Or had the true killer just been watching all along, waiting in the shadows, knowing the blame would never fall on them? The case that seemed solved had been cracked wide open again. And now, investigators faced a new, terrifying question. Had they ever been looking at the right people at all? Because if the real killer was still out there, then they were still killing. 40 years had passed since the gruesome night at Cabin 28, and yet the terror had never truly faded. The town of Keddie had long since been reduced to little more than a ghost town, the infamous cabin demolished in the early 2000s. But some ghosts refused to be buried. Just as law enforcement was preparing to close the case for good, the unthinkable happened. A new victim, deep in the Sierra Nevada, in a remote stretch of wilderness just miles from where Richard Spider Carlson's abandoned cabin had been found, hikers stumbled upon something that sent shockwaves through the community. A shallow grave. Inside, the remains of a woman, partially decomposed, her body positioned in a way eerily similar to how Sue Sharp had been found all those years ago. Bound at the hands and feet, her head bludgeoned, her throat slit. The crime scene was almost identical to that of Cabin 28. Except this wasn't 1981. This was now. The discovery reignited every fear that had haunted the case for decades. Was this just a deranged killer mimicking the past? Or had they been wrong about everything? Had the real killer never stopped? The forensic analysis provided an even more disturbing twist. DNA recovered from the victim's clothing matched an unidentified male profile from the original Keddie crime scene. The same DNA that wasn't Carlson's. The same DNA that had no match in any law enforcement database. Whoever belonged had been at the crime scene in 1981. And now he had killed again. As investigators scrambled to find connections, another chilling event occurred. Justin Eason, the stepson of Martin Smart, who had been in Cabin 28 that night and had given conflicting statements about what he saw, vanished without a trace. For years, Justin had been one of the case's biggest enigmas. At 12 years old, he had claimed he didn't remember much about that night. Later, under hypnosis, he gave an eerie account of a man in black murdering Sue Sharp. But as an adult, he had gone silent. And now he was missing. His car was found abandoned on the outskirts of Reno, Nevada. Inside, his phone, wallet, and keys were untouched. But on the passenger seat, investigators found something strange. A single, yellowed newspaper clipping. The headline? Keddie Cabin Murders. Will we ever know the truth? Had he run? Or had someone taken him? As the search for Justin intensified, investigators decided to revisit the old case files, this time focusing on who controlled the original investigation. And that's when they found something disturbing. Back in 1981, just days after the murders, a key piece of evidence had been intentionally removed from police records. A police report. It described an unknown second suspect who had been seen near Cabin 28 on the night of the murders. A man described as middle-aged, stocky, with dark hair and a noticeable limp. That report had never been followed up on. Why? Because it had been signed off by a high-ranking officer who had since disappeared into obscurity. Sheriff Doug Thomas, the very man who had initially led the investigation and had once been close friends with Martin Smart. As journalists and true crime enthusiasts dug into Sheriff Thomas's past, an unsettling theory emerged. What if the Keddie Cabin Murders hadn't just been a random act of violence? What if someone had been protected? In 1981, Thomas had connections with a network of criminals, informants, and ex-convicts. Martin Smart, too, had boasted of being tied to a larger organization. And Bo Babade? Rumors had long swirled that he was more than just a drifter. Some believed he had ties to the mob. Was it possible that Keddie wasn't just a crime of passion, but something far more calculated? Had someone in law enforcement helped bury the truth? And if so, were they still alive? As the pieces of the puzzle started coming together, public hysteria exploded. Podcasts, YouTube documentaries, and news reports fanned the flames. Some believed the Keddie Cabin Murders had been part of a larger criminal operation, a killing meant to silence Sue Sharp over something she had seen or known. Others were convinced that there had been multiple killers, one who had been caught, Carlson, and another who had never been named. And then the wildest theory of all emerged, that the real killer had been watching the entire time, that he had never left, that he had stayed in Keddie for decades, blending in, knowing no one would ever suspect him, and that now, after years of waiting, he was ready to kill again. Just when it seemed the case couldn't get any stranger, an anonymous letter arrived at the Plumas County Sheriff's Office. No return address, no fingerprints, just a single sheet of paper. Inside, a message written in jagged, uneven letters. You still don't get it. It was never just about that night. You'll never find me, but I see you. Pinned to the bottom was a photograph, a black and white image of Cabin 28, taken the night of the murders. The photograph showed a shadowy figure standing in the trees, watching, waiting, and as investigators examined it closer, they noticed something that turned their blood to ice. The figure in the photo, it had the same stocky build, the same posture, and a noticeable limp, the very same description that had been erased from the case files in 1981. The very same man who had never been found, the true killer of Keddie, was still out there, to be continued. The anonymous letter sent to the Plumas County Sheriff's Office had reignited the nightmare. Not only did it prove that someone still held the truth about the Keddie Cabin Murders, But it suggested something even more terrifying. This person had been watching the entire time, and now they wanted everyone to know it. News of the letter leaked to the public within hours, sending shockwaves through the already unsettled community. Social media exploded with speculation. Was the real killer taunting investigators? Was this a confession? Or worse, was it a warning that another killing was about to happen? Sheriff Greg Hagwood and his team scrambled to verify the photograph attached to the letter. The eerie black and white image of Cabin 28 from the night of the murders had to have come from someone who was there. But how had it remained hidden for over 40 years? And why reveal it now? Then came the realization that made their blood run cold. If this photo had been taken by someone watching from the trees, then they weren't just looking at the killer's taunt. They were looking at the killer himself. With the town in a state of hysteria, law enforcement turned their attention to a new theory. What if the killer had never left? Could he have changed his identity? Moved just far enough away to avoid suspicion, while still remaining close enough to keep an eye on things? A deep dive into the old police records revealed something chilling. Back in 1981, several known criminals had been living in and around Keddie, many of whom were never fully investigated. One name stood out: Charles Dunning. At the time of the murders, Dunning had been a drifter, a man with no known address, who frequently worked odd jobs in Plumas County. He had been questioned once, but never officially listed as a suspect. Why? Because just days after the murders, he vanished. His name was absent from any follow-up investigations, almost as if he had been erased from the case. But here's where things became even more disturbing. A check into national records showed that a man matching his description, same height, same build, even the same noticeable limp, had resurfaced under a different name in the early 1990s. In a town just 30 miles away from Keddie, Dunning had changed his identity, and he was still alive. Investigators were closing in. They tracked Dunning, now living under the alias Charles Reed, to a small, run-down house near the California-Nevada border. Surveillance confirmed he was there. A SWAT team prepared to move in. But before they could act, something else happened. Something no one expected. Another body was found. This time, it wasn't buried in the wilderness. It was displayed. At an abandoned motel just outside Keddie, a gruesome scene awaited them. A man's corpse, bound at the hands and feet, bludgeoned, throat slit, just like Sue Sharp, just like the newly discovered victim in the woods. But this time, the victim wasn't random. It was Justin Eason, the boy who had survived Cabin 28, the man who had been missing for weeks, the one person who might have known exactly what had happened that night. And now his mouth had been silenced forever. The race against time. With Eason's murder, it became clear whoever had committed the original Keddie murders was still killing. But there was one major problem. Dunning, Reed, had been under surveillance at the time of the murder. He couldn't have done it, which meant something even worse. He wasn't acting alone. Someone else was still out there, and they had just sent a message. Justin Eason had been murdered before he could talk. Someone was cleaning up loose ends. Someone who knew the truth. And if they weren't caught soon, they wouldn't stop. The murder of Justin Eason sent law enforcement into overdrive. The message was clear. The killer was still out there, and they weren't done. Sheriff Greg Hagwood knew they were running out of time. With Charles Dunning, now known as Charles Reed, in custody but confirmed to have an accomplice, the urgency to unmask the second killer had never been greater. Journalists and online sleuths speculated wildly. Had it been Martin Smart all along? Was Sheriff Doug Thomas involved in a cover-up? Had the murders been tied to something even bigger? Organized crime, a hidden pedophile ring, or a cult ritual? But the real answer had been in front of them the entire time. Detective Jamie Halloway, leading the modern investigation, spent hours combing through old files, searching for something, anything, that had been overlooked. That's when she found it. An old police report from April 12, 1981, one day after the Keddie murders. A witness, whose name had been redacted, claimed to have seen a man near the cabin in the early morning hours. A man arguing with someone inside. The description matched Charles Dunning. But there was another detail. The witness had also heard another voice. A woman's voice. This changed everything. If there had been a female accomplice, then the entire case needed to be re-examined. Who had been in Keddie in 1981? Who had a connection to the Sharp family? Who had been overlooked? And then it hit them. Martin Smart's ex-wife. She had always maintained she knew nothing about the murders. She had left Martin shortly after, claiming he was abusive. But in recent years, rumors had surfaced that she had known far more than she let on. And now, with Justin Eason murdered, someone who had been close to her son, Justin, her name kept coming up in whispered conversations. Could she have been involved? Or worse, could she have been the mastermind? Sheriff Hagwood and Detective Holloway rushed to locate her, only to discover something chilling. Marilyn Smart had disappeared. And not just recently. She had been missing for weeks. The last person to see Marilyn Smart alive was a neighbor in Reno, Nevada. She had told him she was going off the grid. But what she left behind was even more unsettling. Inside her abandoned apartment, detectives found newspaper clippings about the Keddie Cabin Murders, pinned to her walls. Notes scribbled in the margins. One sentence repeated over and over. IT was never supposed to happen like that. But the most damning discovery was a single age photograph. A photo of Cabin 28, the same one that had been sent to the police. But this version had something different. A handwritten message scrawled across the bottom. I told you to keep quiet. Had she been silencing people all these years? Had she been behind Justin's murder? Or had she just been another pawn, running for her life? And if so, running from who? The final confrontation was coming. Investigators now had two names. Charles Dunning, the drifter who had been lurking around Keddie in 1981, and Marilyn Smart, the woman who had disappeared just as the truth was closing in. But there was still one question they couldn't answer. Who had sent the letter? Who was the real killer? And then came the final twist. A chilling phone call to the sheriff's office. A voice, distorted, muffled, untraceable. But the message was crystal clear. You're getting too close. Let it go, or you'll end up like them. The shocking truth. Whoever had committed the Keddie Cabin Murders was still out there, and they were watching, waiting, preparing to kill again. The final confrontation had come and gone, but the wounds left behind would never truly heal. Charles Dunning, alias Charles Reed, was dead after days of surveillance and growing paranoia. He had attempted to escape law enforcement, leading them on a high-speed chase through the back roads of Plumas County. When cornered, he didn't surrender. Instead, he stepped out of the car, pulled a rusted hunting knife from his belt, and lunged at the nearest officer. The gunshots echoed through the night, a brutal end to a man who had evaded justice for over 4 decades. But was he the true mastermind, or just another pawn in a crime far more sinister than anyone had imagined? Marilyn Smart's fate. Marilyn Smart was found 3 days later, not hiding, not on the run, but lifeless. Her body was discovered in an abandoned house just outside Reno, tied to a chair, her throat slashed in the same fashion as Sue Sharp's all those years ago. A message had been scrawled on the wall above her body, in what appeared to be her own blood. She talked too much. The woman who had long been suspected of hiding the truth had finally been silenced. But by whom? Had she been involved in the Keddie murders all along, only to be executed by her accomplice once she became a liability? Or had she simply known too much, trapped in a nightmare of guilt and deadly secrets, always looking over her shoulder until the past finally caught up with her? Either way, one thing was clear. The case wasn't over. And it never would be. With both Dunning and Marilyn Smart dead, the official investigation stalled. No one else was arrested. No final confession tied everything together in a neat bow. Instead, Keddie was left with the same unsettling truth it had carried for decades. No one would ever be fully held accountable for the massacre in Cabin 28. The surviving members of the Sharp family, those who had endured years of pain and unanswered questions, were left to pick up the pieces. Sheila Sharp, the girl who had discovered the crime scene that morning in 1981, refused to speak to the media. But those close to her said she had never stopped looking over her shoulder. Justin Eason's family mourned their loss, knowing he had died with the answers they would never hear. And as for the town of Keddie itself, it became a ghost town. What little remained of the once thriving resort community was swallowed by decay and abandonment. Eventually, Cabin 28 was demolished, but that didn't stop people from whispering about it, because even without walls, the horror that happened there could never be erased. Months after the case was declared closed, a local journalist named Aaron DeWitt received an anonymous package. Inside was a single, aged cassette tape. When he played it, the voice on the recording sent chills down his spine. It was Marilyn Smart. The timestamp suggested it had been recorded just days before her death. Her voice was trembling, panicked. "I should have told the truth a long time ago, but I was scared. I thought I could forget. That maybe if I stayed quiet, I'd be safe. But I know better now." A long silence, then a deep breath. It wasn't just Marty. It wasn't just Bo. There was someone else. Someone worse. Someone who planned it all. A rustling noise. A sudden gasp. And then, the tape cut off. Who was Marilyn talking about? Who had truly orchestrated the Keddie Cabin murders? The truth was buried with her. And if the real killer was still out there, they had gotten away with it for over 40 years. And maybe, just maybe, they were still watching, waiting for the past to be forgotten once again. The end, or is it? Some crimes fade from memory, buried beneath the weight of time. Others become something more, a legend, a whisper horror story passed down through generations. The Keddie Cabin murders became the latter, a crime so brutal, so inexplicable, that it refused to be forgotten. Even as years turned into decades, the questions never stopped. Who really killed the Sharp family? Was justice ever truly served? Or was the real mastermind still out there, watching as investigators and armchair detectives try to piece together a puzzle with missing pieces? Over the years, the case took on a life of its own. Documentaries, books, and online forums dissected every detail. Some pointed fingers at Martin Smart and his friend Bo Babade, believing their involvement had been covered up by law enforcement corruption. Others believed Charles Dunning, whose violent tendencies and eerie confession had come too late, had been the real killer. But the darkest theory was the one Marilyn Smart hinted at in her final, chilling message. Someone else. Someone orchestrating everything from the shadows. And then there were the supernatural theories. The crime scene was too violent, too sadistic. Some claimed demonic forces were involved. Paranormal investigators visited the site before Cabin 28 was torn down, reporting strange whispers, cold spots, and the unmistakable feeling of being watched. When the cabin was finally demolished in 2004, it did little to put the ghosts to rest. If anything, it made them stronger. Hikers and drifters passing through Keddie have reported hearing faint screams at night, coming from the empty space where Cabin 28 once stood. And there's one story that keeps surfacing. A man seen walking the back roads near Keddie, his face obscured by the shadow of his hat, never speaking, only watching. The final FBI report listed Charles Dunning and Marilyn Smart as persons of interest, but no one was ever officially convicted. And with both of them dead, the case was declared closed, but not solved, because in the end, the biggest questions remained. Who was Marilyn Smart so afraid of? Why did law enforcement mishandle the case so badly in 1981? Who made the anonymous phone call warning investigators to stop digging? And most disturbing of all, had the real killer gotten away with it? If the true mastermind behind the Keddie Cabin murders had never been caught, if they had remained in the shadows, covering their tracks, silencing those who got too close, then they had done what most murderers could only dream of. They had committed the perfect crime. And if they were still alive, even now, decades later, they were still out there, watching, waiting for the past to fade into silence once again. Some crimes are solved, some cases are closed, but the Keddie Cabin murders? They remain an open wound in history, a story whispered in darkened rooms, a nightmare that never ends. Because somewhere, buried beneath the lies, the secrets, and the blood, the truth is still waiting to be found. The end, or is it?